2D games will never go away. Developers will always make them, and we will always play them. And this is more than just my personal belief. As of today, 2D games account for a market value of $5.2 billion on Steam alone. 36% of game developers use 2D engines, including myself, and mobile gaming continues to be a dominating force in the industry, with the majority of casual games operating in the 2D space. AAA studios also continue to generate 2D games, even with their vast amounts of resources, massive swaths of developers, and relatively recent history of predominantly producing 3D games. These studios, often designed to be more money-making machines rather than completely artistic entities, also see the value 2D offers to players. And then of course there's the whole market of indie developers who have delivered us true masterpieces in this confined two-dimensional space. So what's the deal? Why are 2D games still so popular? Is it just developers trying to cut corners and make cheaper games? Or is there something else going on here that is keeping this old school style of gameplay in the limelight? Spoiler, there are actually a lot of things going on here. Things that have led me to 100% believe that 2D games will never go away. And it's not just some of the obvious reasons like 2D games being easier to develop or easier to learn for players. There are game mechanics and innate design practices that can only exist in 2D games that can't be achieved in 3D games. These mechanics have stood the test of time, and they will keep this medium alive and well for years to come. Now, when I talk about game mechanics, I'm talking about rules, systems, and interactions that define how games work and how players interact with them. So, for example, platformers, both 2D and 3D, use the mechanic of jumping to allow the player to traverse terrain and jump over gaps. Within that framework, the game can expand on the experience with other movement-related mechanics, like the way the player bounces on springs, grabs ledges, or climbs vines. So the term game mechanic can apply to broad ideas like movement mechanics and turn-based systems, or more specific ideas within those large ideas like ledge grabbing within a movement system or selecting an attack within a turn-based system. Anyway, there are many mechanics and systems within gaming that can truly only be designed in 2D environments. Ones that are time-tested and have proven to still be fun today, and even ones that have only just recently been invented. Now, obviously, I don't think it would be possible to list every 2D specific mechanic, but I can pinpoint 3 categories of mechanics that I think really differentiate 2D games from 3D games for the better. Those 3 categories are unique aspects of 2D movement systems, point and click as a gaming medium, and creative uses of viewports and camera systems. Now, before I get into all of these points, I should point out that when I started developing games, the biggest reason I chose a 2D engine called GameMaker was because I thought it would be much easier to make 2D games than 3D ones, which honestly I think is pretty true. Since then though, I've spent over 4 years developing games in this engine, and I feel that I've learned a lot about how 2D games really do add unique value to player experiences, which is honestly why I have no hesitations about praising GameMaker, who is the sponsor of this video. I've spent a lot of time with this engine, and speaking from experience, I can tell you it's very easy to learn, exciting to master, and just intuitive to work with. It has both a coding and non-coding option, so you don't even need to be a programmer to pick it up. With that said, I found the language to be pretty darn intuitive and forgiving for my sometimes less than optimal way of coding things. Another thing I have always loved about GameMaker is how friendly they are to indie developers. They have a free version that literally provides you all of the engine's functionality for creating games for personal use. And if you want to sell your games commercially, it's just a one-time purchase for the professional license. Even the enterprise license, which lets you port to consoles as well, has a super reasonable price tag. GameMaker also has tons of tutorials available online and a super supportive community in general. Not to mention some of the greatest 2D indie games ever made were made in this engine. Anyway, I've provided a link to how to get started in GameMaker below, and I totally recommend checking it out if you're looking to start making video games of your own. Anyway, back to why 2D games will never go away. First, I want to talk about movement systems. Moving in a 2D space, whether it be in platformers, RPGs, or action-adventure games, is a uniquely different experience from moving in a 3D space. Both are great for their intended purposes, but there's something specific about how movement feels in 2D games that keeps it engaging and fun to play. A good comparison comparison to make here is between Mario and Mario. And for the sake of maintaining some degree of consistency in less relevant variables, let's look at two Nintendo Switch games, Super Mario 3D World and Super Mario Wonder. Super Mario 3D World is a great game. The world feels alive, there's plenty to explore, and the movement is super fun. Mario's trademark jump is as smooth as ever, and the terrain complements the movement systems associated with power-ups very nicely. So I hope that what I'm about to say doesn't come across as overly critical, because I really do love this game. But the truth of the matter is, movement in 3D World feels less controllable, less precise, and in turn less intuitive and less satisfying than the movement in Mario Wonder. And it's no fault of the designers, it's just the nature of platforming in a 3D space. We play on what is effectively a 2D analog stick, or the more explicitly two-dimensional D-pad, so to get Mario to move where the player intends for him to go requires inferences that just simply can't perfectly mirror the intended inputs. Add the variability of the camera's position in relation to Mario, and you have even more imprecision. There has to be a constant feedback loop between what the player sees on screen and corrections they have to make to their inputs to ensure Mario goes the right way. It's a pretty cool feedback loop in its own right, but again, it's not always precise, and it's not always easy to perfectly control. Contrast that with Mario Wonder, where the game's movement does mirror the 2D plane of the player's inputs. Left always moves left, right always moves right. Mario will always move precisely where the player is expecting him to move. When you accidentally walk off a cliff, it feels like your fault, not the game's fault, for either having controls that feel harder to use, or worse, providing a camera angle that made it impossible to really gauge how close to the edge you actually were. With movement more tightened down in 2D platformers, they're able to ramp up difficulty related to that movement more readily than 3D games can. Higher difficulty levels, in turn, provide higher levels of satisfaction when you complete that oh-so-juicy sequence of leaps and bounds across particularly challenging obstacles. And the benefits of 2D movement aren't limited to just platformers. Several other genres also leverage the unique strengths of 2D movement to make for simpler and more controllable feedback loops between character movement and player inputs. It's just fun to move around in 2D games. Okay, the second strength of 2D games that I want to explore is their unique ability to provide fun experiences using the tried and true point-and-click mechanic. And I'm not talking about the point-and-click adventure genre, which sadly is kind of dead. I'm just talking about the actual motion of moving a cursor or finger to make selections in-game. Anyway, semantics aside, this gameplay mechanic, in which the player isn't controlling a character per se, but instead is just selecting objects on the screen, really shines in 2D games differently than it does in 3D games, especially when considering puzzle games and those bite-sized arcade-like mobile games. Some of the most successful games of all time are in this category. Whether you like these games or not, you can't dispute their wild success and their strong argument for the continued relevance of 2D games. You don't have to be a gamer to enjoy them. You don't even need a gaming PC or video game console. You just need a tablet or smartphone. They're simple, easy to understand, easy to access, and easy to learn. Even outside of mobile-specific games, point-and-click games like Balatro, Papers, Please, Slay the Spire, and the countless surge of visual novels have proven this style of 2D gameplay is still in very high demand. Regardless of the advances in VR or new 3D gaming experiences and mechanics, I just can't shake the notion that 2D point-and-click mechanics like these will always be popular. Okay, now the last thing I want to bring up that is unique to 2D games is how they are able to use viewports and cameras in ways that aren't always readily available in 3D games. And bear with me on this one, I realize it's a bit in the weeds, but hopefully it helps highlight how 2D just comes with a different set of affordances and design principles. Now, when I talk about viewports and cameras in this context, I'm talking about what the player is able to see on the screen, regardless of if it would technically be viewable or not by the character in the game. The 2D space allows designers to play with viewports and reveal information to players in ways that aren't always available in 3D. For example, consider the way views are used in the 2D action-adventure game Hyper Light Drifter versus its successor, Hyper Light Breaker. In Hyper Light Drifter, the camera has a god-level view of the terrain, and the player can almost always see enemies, regardless of where they are in relation to the character, so long as they're relatively close enough. There aren't blind corners, and you can use this to your advantage by intentionally avoiding specific enemies or dodging out of their view while still being able to see where they are and what actions they're performing. With this sort of camera system, game designers have more liberty to create complex terrain, like multi-room puzzles or maze-like corridors, without having to worry about accidentally hiding important information from the player or sacrificing information feedback loops. Contrast that with Hyper Light Breaker, where almost all combat has to reside in open areas. Too many walls or obstacles would limit what information is available to the player, so the developers have opted to just not always have them, which is totally fine, by the way. Open combat like this can still be an exciting experience, and it has its own strengths above what can be achieved in 2D games. But when thinking about physical objects in the game, designers are actually more limited to what kinds of obstacles and terrain they can use to prevent accidentally hiding things from the player. This in turn can limit the kinds of environmental movement systems in 3D games, all because of what the camera can or can't show when operating in a 3D space. Now, you might say that it's just a question of camera location. What about isometric top-down 3D games like Hades or Echoes of Wisdom? My response to that is, are they actually 3D games? It honestly is probably a discussion for a completely different video, and I'm sure there are divisive opinions on this, but Hades is actually secretly a 2D game. Truly, the sprites are just rendered from 3D models, but the game itself actually operates in 2D. And Echoes of Wisdom still functionally only operates on an X and Y axis. Anyway, we can fight over all of that in the comments if you really want to. So those are my reasons for why 2D games will never go away, coming from a game developer who lives and breathes this game design stuff every day. I'm sure there are many other arguments for and against 2D games, but you just can't deny that they're still widely popular, and they don't seem to be slowing down anytime soon. What other reasons do you think have driven the continual popularity of 2D games? Are you seeing any trends that might positively or negatively impact them? Let me know in the comments. I'd also be remiss if I didn't talk about Tethergeist, the game I'm working on with my dev partners, Noah, Ray, and Jeff. It's a precision platformer inspired by the likes of Celeste, Hyper Light Drifter, and Studio Ghibli. If any of those words sparked your interest, we'd be honored to have you head over to Steam, play our demo, and drop us a wishlist. We also have a devlog series here on YouTube where we talk about our process and let you peek behind the curtains as we build our dream game. If you want to keep up to date on our progress, consider subscribing. Anyway, that's all I've got. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you next time.